3 stories of encounters with El Hombre del Sombrero. Based on real stories. Not all terror comes from fiction. Story 1. Paralysis. The man who watches me while I sleep. Sleep should be our sanctuary, our escape. That brief interval where consciousness surrenders and we finally rest. But what if, in that most vulnerable moment, something waits for you? Something that feeds on your fear, that breathes your insecurity, that delights in your profound helplessness. Mexico City has always been a fascinating paradox to me. A metropolis of skyscrapers and wide avenues, built upon the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the ancient Aztec capital. A place where the modern and the ancestral coexist in an awkward yet inevitable dance. My name is Miguel Hernandez. I'm a neurophysiologist specializing in sleep disorders at the National Institute of Neurology. The irony doesn't escape me. I spent years studying the mechanisms of sleep, only to become a victim of its most terrifying aspect. I grew up in the outskirts of Coyoacan, a neighborhood where ancient stories still echo in the colorful walls of colonial houses. My grandmother, Doña Guadalupe, was a formidable storyteller. With her time-wrinkled face and eyes that seemed to guard ancient secrets, she would gather us, cousins, neighbors, any child within earshot, and transport us to worlds inhabited by creatures from another plane. Among all the supernatural entities of Mexican folklore, one always caused me peculiar discomfort: El Hombre del Sombrero, the Hat Man. He is not like La Llorona or the Chupacabra, my grandmother would say, lowering her voice almost to a whisper. Those have an origin, a story, a beginning. El Hombre del Sombrero has always existed, lurking at the boundaries between wakefulness and dreams. She described him as a slender figure, abnormally tall, dressed entirely in black, a wide-brimmed hat concealing any trace of his face, except sometimes for a pair of eyes that glowed like dying embers in the darkness. He visits those who are between worlds, she explained. In the moment when your body falls asleep but your mind is still awake, he observes, learns, and feeds on your fear. Naturally, with my scientific background, I considered these stories exactly for what they were: products of a creative mind shaped by centuries of oral tradition. Beautiful metaphors to explain phenomena that modern science identifies as sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucinations. How naive I was. Everything began approximately 4 months ago, when I moved into an apartment in the historic center, a building from 1905, with that decadent elegance typical of Porphyrian architecture: high ceilings, elaborate moldings, massive dark wooden doors, the kind of place with its own personality, where shadows seem denser and silence has texture. My work at the Institute was demanding, and I frequently arrived exhausted, falling into bed without energy for anything else. Sleep came quickly, but it wasn't restful. From the first night, I had the strange sensation of not being alone in the apartment. Nothing concrete, just that peripheral perception, as if something moved in the corners of my field of vision, disappearing when I tried to focus on it. Subtle noises that could easily be attributed to the old structure of the building or to neighbors. A cold draft that seemed to follow an almost intentional pattern. On the third night, I experienced my first episode. I woke up, or thought I had woken up, feeling a presence in the room. I tried to move, only to discover that my body was completely immobilized. The sensation was terrifying, my mind fully conscious, but my muscles responding to no command. I couldn't even blink. That's when I noticed the figure in the corner of the room. Tall, slender, dressed in dark garments that seemed to absorb what little light entered through the blind's cracks. And that wide-brimmed hat, practically identical to my grandmother's description. What disturbed me most, however, was its complete immobility. It simply watched. When I finally regained control of my body, I sat up gasping, heart hammering against my ribs, cold sweat trickling down my spine. The corner where I had seen the figure was empty. Sleep paralysis, I diagnosed myself, applying the scientific knowledge I had acquired in years of study. Hypnagogic hallucinations intensified by stress and perhaps reminiscences of my childhood stories. The explanation was rational, sensible, and absolutely insufficient to calm the primal terror I had experienced. In the following days, I tried to improve my sleep hygiene. I eliminated caffeine in the afternoon, established regular schedules, avoided screens before bedtime. I used all the tools I recommended to my own patients. It didn't help. The episodes continued, initially spaced, then more frequent. An elderly neighbor, Doña Carmela, noticed my increasingly deteriorated state as we crossed paths in the hallway. "Not sleeping well, doctor?" she asked, her dark eyes studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. When I mentioned vague problems with insomnia, she made the sign of the cross. "This building has history," she murmured. "The apartment where you are. Things happened there." When I pressed for details, she hesitated, looking nervously at my apartment door as if fearing something might hear her. "The man who lived there before you. He studied things, ancient books, strange symbols. They say he was obsessed with the space between worlds." She lowered her voice to a whisper. "He disappeared, simply evaporated. They found the apartment empty, but with all his belongings still there, as if he had gone out to buy bread and never returned." I thanked her for the information, pretending not to give it importance. But that same night, in an impulse that mixed scientific curiosity with growing paranoia, I installed a motion-activated camera in the bedroom. The recording from that night showed something that still disturbs me. Before reviewing the recording, I decided to approach the problem methodically, like the scientist I've always been. I began documenting each episode in a journal, noting patterns, frequency, duration, and environmental variables. The most evident pattern was the timing. Regardless of when I fell asleep, the episodes consistently occurred between 3:00 and 3:33 a.m., what specialists call the dead hour, when the body reaches its lowest point of temperature and vitality. I also noticed that the room temperature dropped drastically during the episodes, often reaching 60 degrees Celsius in an apartment that normally maintained around 72 degrees Celsius, even without air conditioning running. I wasn't yet prepared to accept supernatural explanations, but these anomalies were too disturbing to ignore. I decided to seek professional help, not as a doctor, but as a patient. My colleague, Dr. Sofia Mendez, a sleep disorder specialist, conducted a series of tests. EEG, MRI, comprehensive blood analyses, all came back normal. Classic sleep paralysis was her diagnosis, probably triggered by stress and potentially exacerbated by some environmental element in your new apartment, perhaps mold or some volatile, organic compound affecting your sleep quality. She prescribed a mild sedative and suggested I consider changing apartments. I accepted the medication but wasn't ready to give up on my new home, not without understanding what was happening. That's when I finally analyzed the motion camera recording. The footage showed a normal bedroom with my sleeping body in bed. At 3:15, there was a visible disturbance, not in the image itself, but in the quality of the recording. The footage became grainy, with static interference. The date and time in the corner of the screen began to flash erroneously. And there, almost imperceptible on first viewing, an anomaly in the area near the window. Increasing the contrast and reducing the speed, I could distinguish what appeared to be a greater density in the shadows, a vaguely humanoid form that shouldn't be there. More disturbing still, as the form solidified, the room sensors registered a temperature drop of 9 degrees in less than a minute. I showed the recording to Sophia, who initially suggested compression artifacts or problems with the camera's sensor. But when I presented the corresponding temperature data, she became visibly uneasy. "We need more evidence," she insisted, her professional skepticism in conflict with what her eyes witnessed. I decided to expand my investigation, researching similar accounts in different cultures. What I discovered was deeply unsettling. In practically every tradition around the world, there were reports of a shadowy figure, often wearing a hat, that appeared during episodes of sleep paralysis. In the United States and Canada, it was known as the Hat Man. In Japan, one of the forms of kanashibari. In Turkey, karabasan. In Sweden, mara. Specific details varied, but the core remained consistent. A dark entity, often wearing a hat, that observed its victims during episodes of paralysis. How could people from radically different cultures without contact between them report the same entity? Scientific skepticism would suggest common archetypes of the human unconscious, similar manifestations because we share the same basic neurology. But what if it was the opposite? What if these consistent reports pointed to something objectively real, something that had always been there, watching from the border between worlds? In my search for answers, I found an unofficial study group at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, led by Dr. Carmen Valdez, an anthropologist specializing in folkloric phenomena. The group had collected hundreds of accounts and begun to identify disturbing patterns. "What we're seeing defies simple categorization," Dr. Valdez explained in our first meeting. "We have evidence on multiple sensors, temperature, electromagnetic fields, even infrared radiation. Something is present during these episodes." She showed me data collected from volunteers who had experienced encounters with the Hat Man, significant electromagnetic oscillations, inexplicable temperature drops, and most disturbing, subtle but measurable differences in the chemical composition of the air during the episodes. Analyses show elevated levels of sulfuric compounds and traces of elements that normally shouldn't be present, she explained, showing graphs and tables. "It's as if this entity's presence temporarily altered the very laws of physics in the immediate environment." The most disturbing discovery came when Dr. Valdez shared historical records her team had unearthed. Reports of a shadow man dated back centuries, appearing in diaries, letters, even in hieroglyphs in some ancient cultures. "What you're experiencing isn't new, Miguel," she said, her eyes conveying a compassion that only intensified my discomfort. "It's been happening since humanity began recording its experiences." Armed with this knowledge and a growing collection of monitoring equipment, I returned to my apartment determined to capture more concrete evidence. The scientist in me still sought a rational explanation, even as the primitive instinct screamed for me to flee and never look back. The following night, I transformed my bedroom into an improvised laboratory. I installed temperature sensors at different points, 2 electromagnetic field meters, an infrared camera, and even an air volatile compound detector. If something happened, it would be recorded. I took half of the prescribed sedative. I wanted to remain susceptible to paralysis, but with some chance of maintaining part of my consciousness intact. Sleep came irregularly, fragmented. At some point I entered the hypnagogic state, that delicate threshold between wakefulness and sleep where consciousness begins to dissolve. That's when I felt it. That unmistakable sensation of weight on my chest, the gradual immobility spreading through my limbs. It was happening again, but this time I was semi-conscious of the process. The air around seemed to become denser, as if the very atmosphere had increased in viscosity. The nighttime noises of the city, always present even in the latest hours, dissipated, replaced by an unnatural silence, so profound that I could hear the blood flowing in my veins. And then, emerging not from the door or window, but as if materializing, from the very shadows of the room it appeared, clearer than ever before. The figure was impossibly tall, having to slightly tilt its head to avoid touching the ceiling. Its black attire reflected no light whatsoever. It wasn't merely dark, but seemed to absorb the luminosity around it, creating a void in the shape of a man. The wide-brimmed hat concealed most of its face, but I could distinguish for the first time traces of a physiognomy, or the absence of one. Where human features should be, there was only an even deeper darkness, except for 2 points that glowed like distant stars. Its eyes, if they could be called that. The sensors in the room went haywire. Later, checking the records, I discovered that the temperature dropped 14 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 30 seconds. The EMF meter showed readings that exceeded its maximum capacity. The infrared camera captured a negative thermal anomaly, not just absence of heat, but something that seemed to actively absorb thermal energy from the environment. The entity remained motionless for several minutes, just watching. Then it did something it had never done before. It moved toward me. Each step was fluid, almost as if it glided over the floor rather than walked. There was no sound of footsteps, only an ethereal whisper, like ancient pages, being turned by a ghostly breeze. It stopped beside my bed, leaning over me. The cold emanating from it was almost unbearable, like being exposed to the vacuum of space. And then, in a voice that wasn't exactly audible, more like thoughts inserted directly into my consciousness, it spoke. Finally found the way, like all the others before you. The sensation was of icy needles piercing my brain with each word. I tried to ask what it wanted, who it was, but my lips remained sealed by the paralysis. It's not who I am that matters, it continued, responding to my non-verbalized thoughts. It's who you will become. The entity raised a hand, long skeletal fingers that seemed more like extensions of darkness than physical limbs, and brought it close to my face. The environment around its hand seemed to distort, as if reality was malleable under its touch. When its fingers were millimeters from my forehead, a strident noise cut through the silence. The building's fire alarm, triggered for unknown reasons at exactly 3:33 a.m. The momentary distraction broke the spell. I felt control returning to my body, starting from my toes and gradually rising. The figure receded, its form becoming less distinct, less solid. Before dissipating completely, however, that non-voice echoed one last time. We will meet again. You are already on the path. When I regained full control, I sat up gasping, shaking uncontrollably. The equipment was still registering anomalies, though they were gradually returning to normal levels. I spent the rest of the night reviewing the recordings, trying to process what I had witnessed. The infrared camera had captured a thermal distortion in the approximate shape of a humanoid figure. The air compound sensors detected brief spikes of substances that normally shouldn't be present in an urban apartment. But the most disturbing evidence came from the audio recordings. Filtered and amplified, the voice I had heard only in my mind was there, distorted, almost subaudible, but undeniably present. The next morning, I shared my discoveries with Dr. Valdez and her team. They confirmed that the patterns corresponded to other documented cases, but the level of interaction and evidence captured were unprecedented. "It spoke to you," said Dr. Valdez, her tone oscillating between scientific fascination and apprehension. "That has never happened before, at least not with someone who managed to record and report afterward." "What did it mean by 'like all the others before you'?" I asked. She hesitated, organizing some notes before answering. "Remember the former tenant of your apartment? He wasn't the only one. We checked the building records. In the last 70 years, there have been 7 unexplained disappearances of people who occupied exactly your apartment." She slid a folder toward me. Inside, photographs from different eras showed the former residents. A university professor from the 1950s, a writer in the 1970s, an anthropology student in the 1990s, and others. All of them were researching similar phenomena before disappearing. She continued, "And all reported encounters with an entity that matches your description. We're dealing with something systematic, Miguel. Something that selects specific individuals for reasons we still don't understand." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't a random observer or occasional victim. Somehow I had been selected, like those before me. More disturbing still, the last disappearance had occurred exactly 5 months before I moved into the apartment. Despite Dr. Valdez's warnings and the instincts that screamed for me to abandon the apartment, something inside me refused to flee. Perhaps it was the obstinate scientist, unable to leave a mystery unsolved. Perhaps it was something more primordial, the sensation that even if I fled, the entity would eventually find me. In the following week, I immersed myself in research on interdimensional phenomena, altered states of consciousness, and protection rituals from various traditions. I consulted anthropologists, parapsychologists, even a priest with experience in unexplained occurrences. Doña Carmela, my elderly neighbor, noticed my increasingly deteriorated appearance, deep circles under my eyes marking a face that had aged years in just weeks. "You've seen him," she stated, not as a question. "El Hombre del Sombrero." When I confirmed, she invited me to her apartment, a cozy place filled with religious symbols and folkloric artifacts. From an old carved wooden box, she removed an object wrapped in red cloth. "This belonged to my great-grandfather, who was a curandero, a healer," she explained, revealing an ornate mirror with symbols engraved on its darkened silver border. "He used it to capture and contain entities that feed on fear and vital essence." She explained that, according to tradition, beings like El Hombre del Sombrero existed in a plane adjacent to ours, perceiving our reality as we see shadows projected on a wall. They could only fully interact with us in liminal states, like sleep paralysis where consciousness floats between worlds. "You cannot destroy it," she warned, "but you can force it to reveal itself completely and then temporarily imprison it." I accepted the mirror with skepticism, but also with gratitude. At that point, I was willing to try anything. That night, I prepared meticulously. I positioned the mirror to reflect most of the room. I installed new equipment, including more sensitive motion sensors and a high-speed camera. I placed protection symbols recommended by Doña Carmela at strategic points. Instead of fighting against sleep, I decided to deliberately induce it. I took an herbal compound prepared by the elderly woman, which, according to her, would intensify my awareness even during paralysis. I fell asleep quickly, but my consciousness remained strangely lucid. When the paralysis began, I didn't fight against it. Instead, I allowed the sensation to envelop me, maintaining the mental focus that Doña Carmela's preparation had provided me. The temperature dropped. The air thickened. That absolute silence engulfed the room, and it emerged exactly as before, gradually materializing from the shadows. But this time, there was something different in its posture, less passive observation, more purpose. Moved directly toward me without hesitation. Leaning over the bed, its non-voice penetrated my mind. "You're ready," just like the others were. I tried to mentally ask what it was referring to. The answer came as fragments of images, memories that didn't belong to me. The former residents, each reaching a similar point of investigation, each finally ready for something I couldn't fully comprehend. "You seek knowledge," the entity continued. "We seek consciousnesses that can withstand what we offer." Its skeletal hands extended, hovering over my chest. Between them, the air seemed to condense into complex patterns, like an impossible geometry materialized. "The truth you seek is beyond the limits of the human mind. But those who insist, those who come as far as you, deserve a glimpse." At that moment, I remembered the mirror. With monumental effort, I forced my consciousness to direct my gaze toward it. In the reflection, I saw not only the entity leaning over me, but something beyond a fragmented vision of a place, dimension, alternative reality. There were no adequate words. Figures similar to the one above me moved in that inconceivable space, observing countless sleeping humans through some kind of dimensional veil. The entity noticed my diverted gaze and followed it to the mirror. A visible disturbance traveled through its form, like ripples in dark water. "Ingenious," it admitted, something akin to admiration permeating its mental voice. "The ancients knew our secrets." Suddenly, the mirror began to glow with its own light, its engraved symbols incandescent like red-hot metal. The entity receded, its form undulating, unstable. What happened next defied my comprehension. The mirror seemed to exert an attractive force on the entity, like a gravitational vortex. The figure distorted, its extremities stretching impossibly as it was pulled toward the reflective surface. A sound filled the room, not exactly audible, but a vibration that resonated through matter, traversing bones and tissues, making my teeth ache and my vision waver. It was like the lament of something ancient and vast being compressed into a space too small. The entity resisted, its hands now gripping the sides of the bed with such force that the metal structure groaned and deformed under its fingers. Its head turned toward me, and for the first time, I could clearly see what was under the hat, or rather, what wasn't there. Where a face should have been, there was only a vertiginous void, like looking into a bottomless well that extended into an impossible infinity. It was as if that absent physiognomy was a window to something beyond human comprehension. Neither darkness nor light, but the absolute absence of anything recognizable. "You don't understand what you're doing," the non-voice whispered in my mind, now fragmented, like static cutting a radio signal. "They need a conductor. They need you, just as they use the others." The mirror's force intensified. The entity's body began to disintegrate into filaments of darkness, being pulled to the reflective surface like fibers being spun. The entire room shook, objects on shelves falling, the walls vibrating as if about to collapse. Inside the mirror, I glimpsed once more that other dimension, and now, with terrifying clarity, I realized there were other figures watching. There, forms similar but distinct from the entity that tormented me. They seemed to react with agitation, their movements conveying something akin to alarm. At the height of this phenomenon, when the entity was almost completely absorbed by the mirror, something unexpected happened. A crack, thin as a hair, appeared on the reflective surface, rapidly extending until it divided the object into a network of fissures. The suction force abruptly ceased. The fragments of the entity that had not yet been absorbed ricocheted violently, spreading through the room like black smoke blown by a sudden air current. And then, silence. The equipment, which had recorded frantic readings, short-circuited simultaneously, their screens flashing before going completely dark. The paralysis that kept me immobile gradually dissolved. I sat up trembling, staring at the now fractured mirror. In the cracks, something like a black liquid pulsated, as if the veins of a living creature had been exposed. Dawn found me in a state of almost transcendental exhaustion. I had spent the rest of the night meticulously documenting everything I had witnessed, recovering what I could from the damaged equipment. The cracked mirror emanated an unnatural cold. I carefully covered it with the same red cloth in which Doña Carmela had stored it, feeling an almost physical resistance when touching it, like magnetic fields repelling each other. At noon, I met with Dr. Valdez and her team in a noisy cafe, deliberately chosen for being the opposite of the oppressive silence that accompanied the entity. I shared the recovered recordings and my complete testimony. The anthropologist listened, without interruptions, her face gradually losing color. "You've had more success than anyone before," she finally said, her voice betraying a mixture of scientific admiration and profound concern. "Not only witnessed, not only recorded, but effectively interacted, interfered in its domain." "What was that dimension I saw in the mirror?" I asked. "And what do they want?" Dr. Valdez removed an old notebook from her bag, opening it to pages covered with complex symbols and notes in various languages. "We've been working with traditions from diverse cultures, trying to catalog what we know about these entities," she explained. "The Hopi called them Watchers. In Celtic tradition, they were known as those who wait beyond the veil. Sumerian texts mention those who study the dreamers." She turned some pages, revealing illustrations that were disturbingly similar to the entity I had encountered. The same tall silhouette, the same wide-brimmed hat, the same absence where a face should be. As for what they want, traditions diverge. Some suggest they are mere observers studying human consciousness as entomologists study insects. Others indicate they seek vessels, human consciousnesses sufficiently expanded to serve as conductors or portals. A shiver ran down my spine as I remembered the fragmented words of the entity. "They need a conductor, just as they use the others of the missing persons," I murmured. "The people who occupied my apartment before." "Exactly. Our theory is that they were recruited, so to speak. Specific personalities attract these entities, analytical, questioning minds, but also intuitive enough to perceive what most ignore. Like a sleep scientist who also grew up with folkloric stories, I concluded, the revelation falling like a weight in my stomach. Dr. Valdez nodded gravely. We don't believe these people were harmed, at least not in the conventional sense. They simply transcended, perhaps, were taken to serve some purpose in their reality. As we digested those implications, my phone vibrated with a notification. It was my security camera app, alerting about detected movement in my apartment, which should be empty. I opened the live feed with trembling fingers. The image showed my seemingly normal bedroom, except for one disturbing detail. The red cloth I had used to cover the mirror was on the floor. The mirror, now exposed, showed no cracks. Its surface was intact and perfectly reflective, and in it, not the reflection of the empty room, but a dark corridor that extended infinitely, where several figures with wide-brimmed hats moved slowly in my direction. I didn't return to the apartment that day. Not the next day either. In fact, I never set foot in that place again. I sent a moving company to retrieve my essential belongings, with explicit instructions not to touch the mirror. When I finally found the courage to check the recordings from that day, I discovered that the cameras had captured something inexplicable. The cracked mirror gradually healing itself, the fissures closing like wounds, cicatrizing at accelerated speed. And then, from its surface, fragments of darkness emerged that reconsolidated in the middle of the room, briefly assuming the form of the entity before dissipating like smoke under sunlight. This happened exactly 47 days ago. I moved to another neighborhood, then to another city. I abandoned my career at the Neurology Institute, unable to reconcile what I had discovered with the limited paradigms of conventional science. Dr. Valdez continues her research. We speak weekly, sharing discoveries and theories. Her group has grown, now including specialists from various disciplines, all united by similar experiences with what we simply call the Watchers. I believed I was safe, that I had escaped. How naive of me. It started 3 nights ago. Small anomalies, objects out of place, temperatures fluctuating without explanation. That persistent sensation of being watched. Last night, I woke up at 3:33 a.m. My body was paralyzed, but my mind perfectly conscious. And there it was, in the corner of the room. Not as distinct as before, more like an impression, a suggestion of presence, but undeniably real. It didn't speak, didn't approach, just watched, as if testing the limits, checking how far it could manifest in this new environment. I wonder now if I ever had a choice. If the others before me fought, resisted, or eventually embraced the inevitable. If the recruitment is just a matter of time. The broken mirror from Doña Carmela is stored in a secure warehouse, constantly monitored. Sometimes the cameras capture subtle movements within it. Shadows that move independently of light sources. Reflections that don't correspond to the real environment. Dr. Valdez believes we didn't capture or imprison the entity that night. On the contrary, we opened a passage, a permanent portal between our realities. Like a wound that doesn't completely heal, allowing infections to enter and exit. I have been dreaming of that infinite corridor I saw in the restored mirror. In each dream, I advance a little further through it. The figures with hats wait patiently at the end, like polite hosts expecting an honored guest. Part of me, The rational, scientific part still seeks explanations within established paradigms. Perhaps all this is a manifestation of a progressive mental collapse. Perhaps I'm developing schizophrenia induced by extreme stress and sleep deprivation. But my instruments don't lie. The recordings don't lie. The correlated testimonies of people around the world, separated by oceans and centuries, cannot be mere coincidence. There is something at the frontier of human consciousness. Something that watches us, studies us, selects us. And once you perceive its presence, once you recognize its reality, you become part of its plan. As I record this testimony, I feel eyes upon me. Not just his, my personal watcher, but theirs. The others I briefly glimpsed through the mirror. As a scientist, I cannot leave this record incomplete. As a human being confronting the incomprehensible, I cannot depart without a warning. If you're watching this, don't look for them. Don't try to prove their existence. Don't examine too closely that sensation of being observed during sleep paralysis, because they are there, always have been, watching, from the other side of a veil that was not meant to be pierced. And once you see them, they never stop seeing you. If this account resonated with you, especially if you've experienced sleep paralysis or inexplicable sensations during the night, share your experience in the comments, with caution. Some say that talking about them attracts their attention. Others believe that sharing weakens their power. Subscribe for more investigations into the boundaries of human reality and the entities that may exist beyond our everyday perception. And remember, even when you think you're alone in your room, perhaps you aren't. Story 2. The Traveler. The shadow that followed me on the road. There are places in the Colombian mountains where the space between peaks creates a vacuum, where time trickles like sand through fingers, where darkness isn't merely the absence of light, but a living, breathing presence. I lost 6 hours of my life that night, and sometimes in my nightmares I'm still searching for them and for myself. My name is Alejandro Morales. I was born in Medellin, but the road has been my true home for almost 25 years. As a truck driver, I know every curve, every incline, every dangerous stretch of Colombian highways. Those of us who spend our lives on the carreteras develop a sixth sense, an instinct that warns us about invisible dangers. The Andes Mountains cut through our country like a powerful ancient spine. In these deep valleys and solitary peaks, legends aren't just stories. They're warnings transmitted through generations, born from experience. I grew up hearing these stories at truck stops, where older drivers shared cases between sips of aguardiente. Among all the legends, one always provoked respectful silence, that of El Hombre del Sombrero, the hat man Don Fernando, an old trucker, with more than 40 years on the roads, was the first to tell me about him. His wrinkled hands trembled slightly as he spoke, not from age, but from living memory. He appears on moonless nights, Don Fernando would say, his voice as rough as roadside gravel. Always in the most isolated stretches where radio signals fail and the next town is hours away. First you feel the cold, a cold that penetrates to the bone despite the engine's heat. Then the headlights begin to fail, as if something were sucking the energy. According to the legend, he is an impossibly tall and thin figure, always dressed in black with a wide-brimmed hat concealing his face in shadow. Sometimes he stands at the roadside. Other times he appears directly in front of you, forcing you to brake suddenly. The worst Don Fernando whispered, "is when you try to look at where his face should be. There are no features there, just a void, a darkness deeper than the night around you." The other truckers nodded gravely. Some made the sign of the cross. I, in my early 20s at the time, merely smiled. Superstitions, I thought. Stories to ward off the tedium of long night drives. But on Colombia's roads, where civilization sometimes seems a distant concept, even the most skeptical learn that some legends have teeth. October 17th, 2018. This date is etched in my memory like a scar. I was transporting a valuable cargo of coffee for export from the Huila region to the port of Buenaventura. The itinerary required me to drive through the night on a particularly remote stretch of the Western Cordillera. The day had been perfect. Blue sky, pleasant temperature, relatively good roads by Colombian standards. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains with golden and purple hues, I felt that familiar satisfaction of being where I belonged. I turned on the radio, tuning to a station playing old cumbias. The cheerful melody contrasted with the growing darkness of dusk. The moon was extremely faint that night, just a thin silver fingernail that barely managed to cast its light over the landscape. Around 11 p.m. I entered the most isolated stretch of the journey. The road snaked between steep mountains, with a sharp slope on one side and a sheer cliff on the other. There were no guardrails at many points, just you, your vehicle, and hundreds of meters of free fall. That's when I noticed the first anomaly. My cell phone, which had lost signal as expected in that remote area, showed 11:18 p.m. and then stopped updating. At first I thought the battery had died, but the device remained on, frozen at that moment. Minutes later, the first fog appeared. It wasn't unusual. We were at considerable altitude and nebulous formations were part of the nocturnal landscape in the mountains. But there was something different about this particular one. Typical. Mountain fog rises from the valleys, ascending like ethereal smoke. This, however, seemed to descend from the upper slopes, like a heavy, deliberate blanket, and its density was abnormal, thick as wet cotton, swallowing the road ahead of me. I reduced speed, activating the fog lights. Visibility dropped to less than 30 feet. The radio, which had faithfully accompanied me with its cheerful melodies, began emitting static, first intermittent, then constant, a sharp and irritating hiss. I turned the knob, trying to find some station. Nothing but noise. When I was about to turn off the device, something made me stop. Among the static, almost imperceptible, there was a voice. Not distinct words, but a whisper, as if someone were very close to the microphone, breathing control and intention. That's when the headlights failed for the first time. 1, 2, 3 brief flickers, as if the electrical system were being drained. My truck was relatively new, only 2 years old with rigorous maintenance. Electrical problems were practically impossible. I hit the dashboard, an instinctive and useless gesture. The headlights stabilized momentarily, but the brightness seemed different, weaker, as if something in the fog absorbed part of the luminosity. And then, through that white and opaque curtain, a silhouette emerged. A figure was standing exactly in the middle of the road, motionless as a statue, apparently indifferent to the several-ton vehicle advancing toward it. I slammed on the brakes hard, feeling the truck skid slightly on the damp asphalt. The lights flickered again and for a brief moment of clarity, fully illuminated the figure. It was a man, if I can call it that, impossibly tall and thin, wearing a dark poncho that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. His head was crowned by a wide-brimmed hat, typical of the region's campesinos, but of such an intense black that it seemed like an absence cut out in reality itself. Most disturbing was his posture. He didn't react to the truck skidding toward. He didn't move a single centimeter, as if he knew with absolute certainty that I would manage to stop in time. And I did. The truck halted less than 6 feet from him. "Oye," I shouted, opening the door and climbing down from the truck, a mixture of anger and concern pulsing through my veins. "¿Qué haces en medio de la carretera? Podría haberte matado." There was no response. The figure remained motionless, partially obscured by the fog that seemed to move around him in an unnatural way, as if the mist responded to his presence, like a pet recognizing its owner. Something prevented me from approaching further. Perhaps survival instinct, perhaps the sudden memory of Don Fernando's stories. I felt a wave of cold so intense that my teeth began to chatter. It was an unnatural cold for the region, even at night in the mountains. "Necesita ayuda?" I asked, my voice weaker now, my anger dissolving into a growing fear. The figure slightly tilted its head, like a curious bird studying something peculiar. It was the only movement it made, but it conveyed such a profound sense of alertness and interest that I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something compelled me to look at the face under the hat. It was an irresistible impulse, like the morbid curiosity that makes us stare at a car accident. I leaned slightly forward, trying to distinguish his features through the fog. There was no face, or rather, there was an absence where the face should be. Not darkness, not shadows, but a void, like a window to absolute nothingness. I instinctively retreated to the truck, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs. In panic, I turned the key in the ignition, once, twice, 3 times, until the engine finally caught with a reluctant roar. When I looked back at the road, the figure had vanished. I stepped on the accelerator, wishing only for distance. The truck pushed through the fog, which seemed to momentarily open to allow my passage, only to close behind me like heavy curtains. My digital clock on the dashboard still showed 11:18 p.m. The display seemed frozen, but the seconds continued to flash, repeating the same minute infinitely. I drove for several more kilometers, trying to convince myself that it had been just a disoriented local resident, perhaps under the influence of some substance, dangerously wandering on the road. The explanation was plausible, comforting, and completely insufficient to calm the terror that had settled in my bones. That's when I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. A pair of extremely bright lights suddenly appeared, approaching at high speed. There hadn't been any vehicle behind me minutes before. It was impossible for anyone to have caught up to my truck so quickly on that winding road. The lights approached until they nearly touched my bumper. They were too intense, with an unnatural bluish glow that didn't resemble conventional headlights. More disturbing still, I couldn't distinguish the vehicle behind those lights, just a dark and undefined form. The radio, which had remained silent since the encounter with the figure, suddenly came back to life. But it wasn't cumbias coming from the speakers anymore. It was a distorted melody, played on instruments I didn't recognize, interspersed with those whispers, now more distinct, more insistent, as if someone were sitting in the passenger seat murmuring directly into my ear. I accelerated, ignoring the dangerous curves. My only thought was to escape those lights, that music, that oppressive sensation that seemed to compress the air inside the cabin. The lights perfectly matched my speed, maintaining the same distance, regardless of how fast I drove. When I slowed down for a curve, they slowed down. When I accelerated on a straight stretch, they accelerated, as if they were connected to my vehicle by an invisible rope. Suddenly, upon taking a particularly tight curve, the lights disappeared. They simply evaporated, without gradually distancing themselves, without veering off in another direction. They were there and then, they weren't anymore. The momentary relief was interrupted when, upon turning the next curve, I saw the hat figure at the roadside again. He wasn't there a second before. There was no way he could have reached that point so quickly, especially on foot. This time, as I passed him at least 50 mep, I am absolutely certain that he turned his head to follow me. A slow, deliberate movement, as if my speed were irrelevant to his perception. It was at that exact moment that all the electrical systems in the truck failed simultaneously. Lights, dashboard, engine, everything dead. The truck silently glided to a stop in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fog and the most complete darkness I've ever experienced. I tried to restart the engine repeatedly, each attempt more desperate than the last. Nothing, not even the click of the starter motor. It was as if all energy had been drained from the battery, the alternator, from every electrical component. Picked up my cell phone to call for help, only to find it completely discharged. Impossible considering it had 80% battery minutes before. The flashlight I always keep in the glove compartment didn't work either. Every source of light or energy had been systematically neutralized. The silence that followed was so profound that I could hear my own pulse. Not even the nocturnal sounds of the surrounding tropical forest, normally a concert of insects and animals, were present. As if a radius of miles around me had been completely emptied of life. That's when I looked out the window and saw him, the Hat Man, standing beside the truck, so close he could have touched the glass. His non-face was turned in my direction, that dark void apparently studying me with palpable intensity. I instinctively turned away, unable to sustain that gaze that wasn't a gaze. When I finally summoned the courage to look again, he had disappeared. But something had changed. I felt a presence inside the cabin, a weight, a density in the air that wasn't there before. The cold intensified to the point where I could see my breath forming dense clouds. And there was a smell, not unpleasant, but strange and ancient, like pages of very old books or basements of colonial churches. Minutes transformed into hours, or at least so it seemed. Time lost all meaning inside that bubble of altered reality. The digital clock on the dashboard remained stuck at 11:18, but the darkness outside suggested that much more time had passed. I began to notice movements in the corner of my eye, shadows, that danced at the limit of my vision, always disappearing when I tried to focus on them directly. These weren't common shadows, projected by objects blocking light sources. They were more like stains on reality itself, moving holes through which something seemed to observe. Panic was replaced by a strange, resigned acceptance. I closed my eyes, reciting all the prayers I could remember from childhood, not out of faith, but from a primitive reflex of seeking protection. That's when I felt the touch. An icy contact on the back of my neck, light as a breeze but solid enough to send an electric current of terror down my spine. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Something primordial in me knew that looking directly at the source of that touch would have consequences beyond my comprehension. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, everything ended. I opened my eyes to find the cabin flooded with the amber light of dawn. The fog had dissipated. The sounds of the forest returned. birds announcing the new day, wind moving the leaves of trees. My watch now showed 5:23 a.m., 6 hours that simply evaporated from my memory. 6 hours during which something happened, something my mind apparently refused to register or recall. The truck started on the first try, as if it had never presented any problem. The radio returned to normal stations, playing the typical morning boleros. My cell phone was charged, although it showed that several missed calls had been made to my number during those lost hours, all from the same origin, a number that didn't exist when I tried to call back. I drove as fast as I could to Santander de Quilichao, the nearest town, arriving shortly after sunrise. I went straight to Rafael Ortiz's mechanical workshop, an old acquaintance who had been taking care of my truck for years. Rafael examined the vehicle thoroughly, inspecting every electrical component, measuring levels and testing systems. His expression became more confused with each test. "The battery is completely discharged," he finally said, showing me the multimeter. "Completely dead. There's no technical explanation for how you managed to drive here." When I mentioned the exact location where I had suffered the breakdown, Raphael visibly paled. He put the tool aside and looked around, as if checking if we were alone, before speaking again. "La curva del sombrero," he murmured, discreetly making the sign of the cross. "You were lucky, friend. Very lucky." That's when Raphael told me about the history of that specific stretch of road. It wasn't just another dangerous curve. It was notorious for unexplained accidents and disappearances. Officially, authorities attributed the incidents to road conditions and human error. Unofficially, locals knew there was something more. 7 drivers had completely disappeared in the last 10 years on that same stretch. Their vehicles found abandoned, sometimes with the engine still running, doors open, but no sign of the drivers, as if they had simply evaporated or been taken. 2 truck drivers were found, continued Raphael, his voice dropping to a whisper. Mendoza and Garcia. But they weren't the same anymore. Francisco Mendoza was found 3 days after his disappearance, wandering through the forest miles from the road. He was in a catatonic state, unable to speak or react to stimuli. He was admitted to a psychiatric institution in Cali, where he remains to this day. His only moments of apparent lucidity occur at night, when nurses find him obsessively drawing the same figure repeatedly. Javier Garcia met an even more disturbing fate. He was found sitting inside his truck at exactly the same location where he had disappeared a week later. Physically, he was intact, without visible injuries, but he had aged decades in a week. His hair completely white, skin wrinkled like ancient parchment, eyes that seemed to have witnessed indescribable horrors. Garcia lived only 3 more months after being found. During that period, he rarely spoke, but occasionally murmured about the man who collects moments and how he knows your name even before you're born. Like Mendoza, he spent hours drawing the same hooded figure with a hat. Raphael directed me to the local police station, insisting that I report the incident. Captain Herrera, a skeptical and pragmatic man, rolled his eyes when I mentioned the Hat Man. Clearly, it wasn't the first time he had heard that story. Probably a smuggler or guerrilla, he suggested, disinterestedly typing in his report. They use the fog to ambush drivers. The electrical problems are caused by interference devices they use. His explanation was perfectly rational, completely plausible and absolutely insufficient to explain what I had experienced. It was his younger assistant, Officer Suarez, who showed genuine interest. When everyone else left the room, he approached discreetly. "My uncle was a truck driver," he said quietly. "He saw him too 15 years ago on the same stretch. He never drove at night again after that." Suarez suggested checking the dash cam recordings. Like many Colombian truck drivers, I kept a camera installed for safety. We connected the device to the police station computer and watched the recording. The video showed the road normally until 11:18 p.m. when the fog began to appear. The image then became distorted, with static interference and chromatic distortions. When the recording stabilized, the clock in the corner of the video showed 5:23 a.m., 6 hours completely erased from the record. Suarez, however, wasn't content with this. He transferred the file to a forensic analysis software used by the department to enhance crime scene images. By drastically slowing down the distorted part and adjusting contrast and brightness, we were able to identify some partially intact frames within the chaos of static. In one of these frames, at 2:47 a.m. according to the counter, although the visible clock still showed 11:18, a dark figure was clearly visible beside the road, tall, wearing the unmistakable wide-brimmed hat. More disturbing was what we found in a later frame, at 4:12 a.m. The camera partially captured the interior of the cabin, where it was possible to distinguish a dark figure sitting in the passenger seat, a space that should have been empty. "Officer, Suarez printed the frames but advised me not to share them widely. Some things," he said with a surprising seriousness for someone so young, "are better when not provoked. I left Santander de Quilichao the same day, refusing to remain longer in the region. Since that night I have never driven alone after sunset. I changed my route, adding almost 60 miles to my usual journey to completely avoid La Curva del Sombrero. But some things cannot be avoided just by changing paths." In the weeks that followed, I began to notice small anomalies in my daily life. Clocks that occasionally stopped for exactly 1 minute and 15 seconds, always at 11:18, regardless of the actual time. Radios that briefly caught static and whispers when I passed through particularly isolated areas, even during the day. And most disturbing of all, the persistent sensation of being watched. Not just when I'm alone on the road, but in hotel rooms, in busy restaurants, even in my own home. Sometimes, always in the periphery of my vision, I catch a glimpse of a tall figure wearing a hat. When I turn to look directly, there's never anything there. But the sensation of presence remains, like a visual echo that persists even after the image dissipates. The experience modified something fundamental in my perception of the world, as if a blindfold had been removed, revealing that the reality we know is just the surface layer of something much vaster and more incomprehensible. 3 months after the incident, I was approached by an anthropologist from Colombia's National University, Dr. Isabella Cortez. She had found my report in police files while researching folkloric phenomena of the Andean region. "What you experienced," she explained during our meeting in a noisy Bogotá cafe, "is not an isolated case. We've been collecting similar reports for decades from different parts of Latin America." Dr. Cortez slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, written accounts, and transcriptions of interviews with people who had encountered similar entities, not just on isolated roads, but in abandoned mines, in dense forests, in ancient tunnels of colonial cities. "In different cultures he receives different names," she continued. "For the Embera indigenous people, he's Jaiba Na Negro, the dark shaman. In Mexico, El Hombre del Sombrero. In Argentina, El Silbón de la Pampa. But the essential details remain constant across borders and languages. One particular detail of Dr. Cortez's research captured my attention: the question of time. Many encounters like mine involve temporal distortions, lost hours, clocks stopping, people returning days later with no memory of the time elapsed. Some indigenous traditions believe that these entities are not supernatural in the conventional sense, she explained. They suggest that they are beings from a reality adjacent to ours, existing in a dimension where time flows differently. The meeting points, like your curva del sombrero, would be places where the membrane between realities is thinner. And what do they want? I asked, my voice more tremulous than I would have liked to admit. The anthropologist hesitated, organizing her thoughts before answering. Theories vary. Some accounts suggest they are mere observers, studying our reality as scientists study interesting specimens. Others indicate a more exploratory purpose. The most unsettling theory, she continued, lowering her voice, is that they feed on something we produce, not our bodies or physical energy, but something more intangible. Experience, time, consciousness, fear. She paused, her eyes studying my reaction. Do you notice the pattern in the missing who return? White hair, accelerated aging, as if years of their lives had been extracted. Months have passed since that conversation. I returned to work, following daytime routes, always accompanied by another driver. I installed more cameras in the truck, motion sensors, even a temperature detector that triggers an alarm when there are sudden drops. I was convincing myself that perhaps I could return to a normal life, that perhaps the incident had been just that, an isolated event, extraordinary but finite. Until 3 nights ago, I was home in Medellin for the first time. In weeks, the quiet apartment, the comfort of my own bed, the reassuring familiarity of a space that was exclusively mine. I woke up at 3:18 a.m. I didn't need to check the clock to know the exact time. The air around me was dense, as if the very atmosphere had acquired a tangible viscosity. The sounds of the city, normally audible even during the early morning hours, had completely disappeared. And although I was fully awake, I couldn't move a single muscle. In the corner of the room, patiently observing, was him. More distinct than ever before, as if in this familiar environment he had less difficulty manifesting completely. The figure was exactly as I remembered, but now I could distinguish details that the road fog had obscured. The poncho wasn't made of conventional fabric. It seemed composed of woven shadows, with patterns that moved subtly, like currents in deep waters. The hands that emerged from the sleeves were impossibly long and slender, with fingers that ended in tapered points, not exactly like claws, but as if matter simply faded away. The hat, clearly visible now, had symbols engraved on its rim. I didn't recognize the writing system, but instinctively knew they were ancient beyond any known civilization. Most disturbing was the void under the hat. It wasn't darkness, it wasn't an absence of light. It was a distortion in the very fabric of reality, as if that absent physiognomy were a window to a vacuum that shouldn't exist in our universe. For what seemed like hours, he simply observed, motionless, silent, studying me with that non-face that somehow conveyed a cold and alien curiosity. And then he did something he had never done before. He spoke, not with an audible voice, but as thoughts that weren't mine being inserted directly into my consciousness. Time is different for us, came the non-voice, cold as Antarctic ice. Your hours are our moments. Your years, our minutes. The words carried concepts that my human mind struggled to process, like trying to explain colors to someone born blind. You saw me, the presence continued. Most pass through us without noticing. They cross the portals without knowing. But you saw. And now, you will always be seen. A skeletal hand moved slowly toward me. Not to touch me, but as if measuring something invisible emanating from me. Your perception is interesting, different. You experience time intensely, you savor your moments. The realization hit me with devastating force. He wasn't just observing me, he was tasting me. Like a wine connoisseur appreciates a rare vintage, he was savoring my experience of time, my consciousness, my fear. We will return, the non-voice promised. You have the flavor of memory, of stories that need to be preserved. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the paralysis ceased. The figure dissolved into the room's shadows, not exactly disappearing, but retreating to somewhere beyond human perception. The city sounds gradually returned. The distant roar of engines, a faraway siren, a dog barking in some nearby yard. Common reality resuming its normal flow. That was 3 days ago. Since then, I've been obsessively reflecting on what the creature meant. You have the flavor of memory. Stories that need to be preserved. I revisited Dr. Cortez yesterday, sharing the new developments. Her theory is disturbing. She believes these entities are a kind of interdimensional archivists, collecting experiences, memories, and stories across the multiverse. Think of it as a living library, she suggested, where the shelves are filled not with books but with consciousnesses, fragments of time experienced by beings from different realities. And the people who disappear? I asked, though I feared. The answer: perhaps they're the most interesting stories, she replied gravely. Those that deserve to be preserved in their entirety. I'm telling this story not just as an outlet or warning, but also as a record. If Dr. Cortez's theories are correct, perhaps the act of sharing my experiences diminishes my value as a specimen for the Watchers, as she calls them. 3 behaviors have become part of my daily routine since the encounter on the road. I never travel at night. I never stay alone in isolated spaces, and I always keep some light source nearby. But the most disturbing truth is that none of these precautions really matter. If they want to find me, they will. Time and space seem to be mere suggestions for these entities, not barriers. What keeps me functional, preventing me from succumbing to absolute terror or paranoia, is the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, they aren't malevolent in the sense we understand. Different, incomprehensible, frightening, yes. But perhaps their purpose transcends our limited notions of good and evil. Dr. Cortez suggested another perspective that finds echo in some indigenous traditions. That these beings are messengers or guardians of the portals between worlds. That their presence marks points where reality is more fluid, where divergent possibilities intertwine. If this is true, then my encounter on the road wasn't coincidence, but convergence. A moment when my path crossed with another, much older and stranger one. I frequently wonder about the 6 hours I lost. What happened during that time that my mind cannot or refuses to process? Part of me desperately wants to know. Another part suspects that this knowledge could be the final catalyst for my sanity to completely crumble. A week ago, I received an anonymous letter. Inside, just a simple drawing, a winding road between mountains, and a tall figure wearing a hat standing on the shoulder. On the back, written in trembling handwriting, "He saw me too, 1976. Someone who went through the same as I did. Someone who survived carrying this knowledge for almost 5 decades. This gives me a strange form of hope. If that person could bear this burden for so long, perhaps I can too. Perhaps there's a way to live with the certainty that there are layers of reality not made for human eyes, that there are ancient presences silently observing from the shadows. Or perhaps this is just what they want me to think. Perhaps resignation is simply the final stage before the harvest." And so, I continue driving along Colombia's roads. During the day, under the bright sun, surrounded by the bustle of normal life, but always vigilant, always conscious of what lurks at the margins of perception. If you ever travel through the Andean mountains, especially through Colombia's western region, pay attention to the signs: sudden drops in temperature, fog that appears against the wind, the abrupt silence of the forest's night sounds. And if someday during a night journey, your headlights illuminate a tall figure wearing a hat, standing silently in the middle of the road, don't stop. Don't look directly. And above all, don't let him notice that you've seen him, because once you see him, you will always be seen. If this story resonated with you, especially if you've had unexplainable encounters on isolated roads, share in the comments, but perhaps avoid too specific details. Some believe that talking about these entities can attract their attention. Subscribe for more accounts of encounters with the inexplicable at the borders of reality. The next story might help you recognize the signs before it's too late. And the next time you're driving at night and your radio catches unexplained static, perhaps it's better to change the station, or better yet, turn it off completely. Story 3. Melody of Vengeance, the Guitarist of Shadows. They say justice is blind, but in the mountains of Guatemala, it wears a wide-brimmed hat and plays a song that only the guilty can hear. I know this because I heard that melody every night for 3 weeks, before my husband vanished forever. My name is Isabel Coti. I live in a small village in the highlands of Guatemala, near the majestic Lake Atitlan. Our community is predominantly indigenous Maya Kaqchikel, where ancient traditions are not museum relics but living practices that breathe alongside the modernity slowly advancing up the mountain slopes. Here, the old stories are not idle entertainment. They are navigation maps for a world where the visible and invisible intertwine like threads in a sacred fabric. I grew up hearing these narratives around the fire, while my hands learned to weave the complex patterns that our ancestors had woven for centuries. Among the many entities that populate our cosmology, there was one that my grandmother, Doña Luisa, mentioned only in respectful whispers, as if naming the creature aloud might summon it. El Hombre del Sombrero, the Hat Man. Unlike other entities in our folklore, he wasn't born from a specific tragedy or a pact with the underworld. According to my grandmother, he simply always existed, an ancient presence that observes, judges, and, when necessary, balances the injustices that men commit against women. It's neither good nor evil, my grandmother explained, her dark eyes reflecting the flames as she adjusted the shawl over her wrinkled shoulders. He's like lightning or flood, a force of nature that responds to imbalances. In the stories, he is described as an impossibly tall and skeletal figure, dressed completely in black, a poncho or cloak that seems to absorb the light around it. His face always remains hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, a sombrero, Negro that belongs to no specific style, as if it had been woven from darkness itself. He comes first as music, my grandmother would tell us, lowering her voice even further. A guitar lament that only the aggressor can hear. It's a warning, a chance for the man to change his ways. But if he ignores it, she never completed the sentence. It wasn't necessary. The silence carried the weight of the inevitable conclusion. I considered these stories part of the rich cultural fabric of our people, a social tool to keep men in check in communities where official law rarely reached. A metaphor for cosmic justice that, though slow, would eventually balance the scales. That was my rational perspective until I met Martin Sikay. Martin arrived in our village from Panajachel, a larger town on the shore of Lake Atitlan. He was tall for a Maya man, with striking features and a smile that lit up his dark eyes. He worked as a tour guide, taking fascinated foreigners to experience our traditions, our culture, the natural beauty of our land. We met during a patron saint festival. He was accompanying a group of American photographers, explaining the meanings of ceremonial costumes and ritual dances. I noticed how he spoke with genuine pride about our traditions, despite himself representing a more modern version, more connected to the outside world. Our courtship was quick, intense. 6 months later, we were married. We built a small house on the outskirts of the village, neither completely traditional nor completely modern, a reflection of our own relationship. Martin continued his work as a guide, and I sold my handcrafted textiles to tourists, a combination that provided us with a comfortable life by local standards. When I discovered I was pregnant, Martin wept with joy. Our daughter, Alicia, was born on a full moon night, with the village elders celebrating her arrival as a good omen. For 2 years we lived in a happiness that seemed unbreakable. Then something changed. It began with news of violence in nearby regions, cartel disputes, confrontations with police, nothing directly related to our community, but enough to frighten tourists. The flow of visitors decreased dramatically. Martin's work became scarce, and our financial stability began to crumble. Martin's frustration grew with each canceled group, each lost opportunity. He began to drink, first occasionally, then with alarming frequency. Alcohol revealed a side of him I had never seen, bitter, resentful, with a volatile temper that inflamed at the slightest provocation. The accusations began subtly. Why did that gringo spend so long looking at your crafts? You smiled too much at him. Who was that man you were talking to in the market? An old boyfriend? I patiently explained that the gringo was merely interested in the traditional weaving technique, that the man in the market was my mother's cousin, whom he knew perfectly well. Martin would apologize the next day, promise to do better, swear it was just temporary stress, but the accusations continued, escalating in frequency and intensity. Paranoia took root in his mind like a poisonous plant, flowering into increasingly absurd suspicions. One stormy night, Martin arrived, drenched and staggering. He had spent our last money on cheap aguardiente. When I mentioned our sick daughter needing medicine, something broke inside him. Probably not even my daughter, he muttered, words slurred by alcohol. Who knows how many men you've been with while I was working? The accusation was so absurd, so profoundly unfair, that I simply froze in shock. It was this moment of vulnerability that he exploited, advancing with blind rage, his fist connecting with my face in an impact that sent stars across my vision. Minutes later, as I cleaned the blood from my split lip and applied a cold cloth to the growing bruise, I heard Martín shouting from the living room. ¿Oyes eso? ¿Quién está tocando música a esta hora? I stood motionless, confused. I heard nothing besides the rain pounding on the roof. Esa maldita guitarra. Cállate. He violently opened the door, staring into the soaked darkness. There was no one there. No musician defying the storm, no untimely serenade. He slammed the door shut, muttering about disrespectful neighbors. I attributed the incident to drunkenness, a hallucination induced by alcohol. Soon he collapsed on the bed, snoring deeply, the episode apparently forgotten. But the following night, completely sober, it happened again. There it is again, he muttered, looking nervously out the window. That melody. Can't you hear it? I heard absolutely nothing. Our daughter, sleeping in the next room, wasn't disturbed by any sound. Only Martín seemed tormented by this phantom music. It's just one note, then another, then another. Too slow to be natural. As if someone were learning to play, or... His voice faltered, eyes fixed on something beyond the darkness of our small veranda. As if someone were deliberately torturing me. In the days that followed, Martín visibly deteriorated. Deep circles marked his face, bloodshot eyes of a man who could barely sleep. The music, he explained in moments of desperate lucidity, began precisely at 3 a.m. and continued for exactly 1 hour. Always the same melody, simple yet disturbing, played on a guitar that sounded slightly out of tune. It's like a requiem, he said one morning, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. A funeral song, but not for someone who has already died. He installed more lights around our house, powerful lanterns that transformed our yard into a beacon in the village darkness. He bought extra padlocks, obsessively checked windows, but no amount of light or security seemed to drive away the music that only he could hear. 1 week after the first episode, Martín saw something that left him completely unnerved. We were having dinner when he looked out the window and dropped his fork, the metal tinkling on the packed earth floor. He's outside, he whispered, eyes fixed on a point beyond the darkness of our small veranda. I followed his gaze but saw nothing beyond the shadows of trees swaying in the night breeze. The moon was hidden by clouds, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. There's no one there, Martin, I responded cautiously, fearing to provoke his anger. You don't see him. His voice trembled. A tall man with a hat, he's playing that damned music and looking directly at me. An icy sensation ran down my spine, like spectral fingers sliding along each vertebra. My grandmother's stories echoed in my mind with crystalline clarity. It was exactly as she described. Concerned about both Martín's mental state and the supernatural implications, I sought out Doña Esperanza the following morning, the most respected healer in the village. She wisely balanced syncretic Christianity with Maya spiritual traditions. If anyone could make sense of what was happening, it would be her. The elderly woman received me in her small house perfumed with medicinal herbs and copal, the sacred incense that connects our world to that of spirits. Without preamble, I told her about the music tormenting Martín and the figure he claimed to see. Doña Esperanza listened in silence, only her dark eyes revealing any reaction. When I finished, she lit more copal, contemplatively observing the smoke rising in silver spirals. El justiciero, she finally said, using another name for the hat man. El vengador de mujeres. He has come to collect a debt. What debt? I asked, genuinely confused. Martín was never perfect, but until recently, Doña Esperanza studied me with eyes that seemed to see beyond flesh directly into the soul. Are you sure, daughter? El Hombre del Sombrero doesn't come for small transgressions. He only appears when innocent women's blood has been unjustly spilled. Something in her statement made me shudder. I remembered fragments of conversations, comments Martín had let slip over the years about his past in Panajachel, rumors about his ex-fiancée, Carmen, who had mysteriously disappeared shortly before we met. He always said she had run away with another man, abandoning him without explanation. What should I do? I asked, my voice almost a whisper. The elderly woman sighed, the copal smoke dancing around her wrinkled face. There is nothing you can do, child. This is not your story, it's his. All you can do now is protect your daughter and yourself. The next day, while Martín was in Panajachel desperately looking for work, I took our daughter to my mother's house. I didn't fully explain, only said that Martín wasn't well, that he needed space to recover. My mother, sensing my poorly disguised fear, asked no questions. She just nodded and embraced Alicia with protective force. Then, determined to discover the truth, I went to Panajachel and sought out Juan Zul, a retired police officer who knew all the region's secrets. After some initial resistance and a small amount of money changing hands, he agreed to tell me about Carmen Ixtabalan. We met in a noisy cafe near the harbor, the buzz of conversations providing privacy amid the crowd. Juan seemed nervous, repeatedly looking over his shoulder as if fearing being observed. Carmen was a beautiful girl, he began, slowly turning his coffee cup. Smart too. First in her family to pass the university exams in the capital. She was about to leave, start a career. He showed me a photo yellowed by time. Carmen was indeed beautiful, with lively, intelligent eyes that seemed to stare at the future with determination. The kind of beauty that simultaneously inspires admiration and awakens possessive jealousy. In insecure hearts, she and Martín were engaged, continued Juan. But there was tension. He didn't want her to go to the capital, said a woman should stay close to her husband, that the big city would corrupt her. Juan paused, taking a sip of coffee before continuing. 2 weeks before the wedding date, Carmen disappeared. Martín said she had run away with a university student she'd met during the exams, that she'd left a note explaining she didn't love him anymore, that she wanted a different life. And you believed him? I asked, already knowing the answer. Her family never accepted that story. Carmen was dedicated, responsible. Even if she wanted to end the relationship, she would never leave without saying goodbye to her parents, without taking her few valuable possessions. We investigated, of course, but he let the sentence die in the air. The meaning was clear. No body, no crime. Especially when the missing person was just another indigenous girl in a region where such occurrences rarely receive adequate attention from authorities. Some say she's at the bottom of the lake, Juan finally said, his voice barely audible. Others that Martín took her to the mountains. We never found proof of anything. He was respected, had influential friends. I left that meeting feeling as if the ground beneath my feet had disappeared. The man with whom I shared a bed, the father of my daughter, could be responsible for his ex-fiancée's disappearance? Was it possible that I had been so blind, so easily deceived by his charming smile and sweet words? When I returned to our house, I found Martin in the yard, frantically spinning in circles, searching for something in the increasingly dense shadows of twilight. His movements were erratic, desperate, like a cornered animal. "He's everywhere. Now!" he shouted upon seeing me, pointing at empty spaces. "Not just at night. He follows me through the village, at work, on the road, always playing that damned music." His eyes were wide, bloodshot, pupils so dilated that the iris was barely visible. Sweat streamed down his face despite the cool evening air, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. "Martin," I said with all the calmness I could gather, "we need to talk about Carmen." The name hit him like a physical blow. He froze instantly, his entire body tensing like a guitar string stretched to the breaking point. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might lunge at me, completing the cycle of violence he had initiated on that stormy night. Instead, he collapsed to his knees, his body racked by sobs that seemed to tear themselves from the depths of his soul. "What do you know?" he asked between tears. "Who talked to you?" I kept my distance, calmly relating what I had discovered from Juan. As I spoke, Martin seemed to wither, as if each word extracted something vital from his being. When I finished, he remained silent for several minutes, only the occasional sound of a sob breaking the evening's quietness. Finally, he raised his face, his eyes reflecting a mixture of terror and resignation. "He won't stop," he murmured. "No matter what I do, no matter where I go. He'll keep playing until I confess, until I pay for what I did." In the days that followed, Martin deteriorated with alarming speed. He barely ate or slept. He spent hours staring at empty points in the air, murmuring responses to questions no one had asked. Sometimes I found him scratching incomprehensible symbols on the walls or repeating the same phrase in Quiche, a Maya dialect he didn't even speak. The music, according to him, was getting louder, more insistent, and now the figure of the man with the hat appeared not only outside but inside the house, standing in dark corners, reflected in shiny surfaces, always watching, always playing. In moments of partial lucidity, Martin mentioned fragments of what he saw, how the face under the hat was an inconceivable void, how the hands that strummed the guitar seemed to have extra joints, how the music conveyed emotions that shouldn't have names in any human language. On a particularly difficult night, when the crescent moon hung like a scar in the sky, Martin finally broke under the weight of his torment. I found him sitting on the kitchen floor, surrounded by shards of broken pottery, blood trickling from cuts on his hands. "It was an accident," he said, his voice strangely calm, eyes fixed on some point beyond the walls of our house. "She wasn't supposed to die." I sat silently before him, letting the words flow without interruption. Carmen said she was leaving, that nothing would stop her from going to the university. We argued. I was so angry. I grabbed her arm just to make her listen. She pulled away, stumbled backward. There was a stone, large and pointed. He closed his eyes, reliving the moment in all its horrific detail. The blood. There was so much blood. From her head. Her eyes were still open, looking at me with surprise, as if she couldn't believe I had done that. I looked at that broken man before me, my husband, the father of my daughter, and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Horror at the crime he was confessing, pity for his tormented soul, relief at finally knowing the truth. "Where is she, Martine?" I asked, my voice strangely calm. "Where is Carmen?" "At the bottom of the lake," he answered. "Tied to stones so she would never rise to the surface. I thought the waters would hide her forever, but he knows. He always knew." As Martine spoke, I realized that the shadows in the corners of our small kitchen seemed denser, more defined. And for the first time since everything began, I heard, so softly that I initially thought it was my imagination, distant notes of a guitar, slow and deliberate, a melody that spoke of loss, justice, and inevitable conclusion. "You hear it too?" Martine asked, raising his face with a start. "You can hear him now." I nodded silently, the sound becoming clearer with each second, as if the musician were approaching, or as if a barrier between us and him were gradually dissolving. And then, from the densest shadow in the corner of the kitchen, something began to take form. It didn't enter through the door or window. It simply materialized from the darkness as if it had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. A tall, skeletal silhouette slowly emerged. Its presence seemed to compress the air, make it denser, colder. Dressed completely in black with a fabric that reflected no light at all, but seemed to absorb it. Between its bony hands, an ancient guitar of dark wood whose strings subtly glowed, as if made of non-earthly material, and on its head the hat, a sombrero with a wide brim that completely concealed any trace of a face. Where human features should be, there was only a void deeper than normal darkness, like a window to a place that shouldn't exist in our world. Martine screamed, an animalistic sound of primal terror that seemed to tear itself from the depths of his soul. He tried to back away but tripped over his own feet, falling backward. The entity emitted no sound. There was no need. Its presence communicated everything that needed to be said. It was judgment personified, the inevitable consequence of actions that could not remain hidden. Slowly, with fluid movements that seemed to defy the natural laws of human motion, the Hat Man stopped playing. The ancient guitar emitted a final note that hung in the air like mist over dark water, reverberating far beyond what would be physically possible. The silence that followed was so deep, so absolute, that it seemed a tangible entity occupying every inch of space between us. The temperature in the kitchen plummeted suddenly. My breath condensed in dense clouds before me, and the pottery shards on the floor began to crystallize with a thin layer of ice, creating patterns that didn't belong to this world. Ancient symbols that seemed pulsating, alive in their impossible geometry. The Hat Man did not speak, not with words that could be captured by human ears, but something was communicated, transmitted directly to the minds present. They weren't exactly thoughts or images, but deep impressions of concepts for which our language has no adequate vocabulary. Justice older than civilization, balance that transcends human morality, the inevitability of reckoning. Martine, still fallen on the floor, began to cry, not with the frenzied desperation of before, but with a resigned acceptance, like someone who finally recognizes a long-denied truth. "I know," he whispered, responding to the entity's silent communication. "I know what I need to do." The figure slightly tilted its head toward Martine. The gesture was almost gentle in its economy of movement, a solemn acknowledgement that a decision had been made. Then, slowly, it extended a skeletal hand in his direction, impossibly long and thin fingers ending in sharp points that weren't exactly claws, but seemed more as if matter simply tapered until it disappeared. The gesture wasn't threatening, but invitational, like an old friend offering help to stand up or a guide indicating the way. Martin looked at me one last time. The terror had disappeared from his eyes, replaced by a clarity I hadn't seen in weeks. There was sadness, regret, but also something akin to relief. "Take care of Alicia," were his last words pronounced, with surprising serenity. "Tell her that her father loved you both, even when he lost himself." Then, with a calmness that contrasted dramatically with his previous frenzy, Martin took the extended hand. There were no supernatural lights, no dramatic sounds. There was no confrontation or resistance, just shadows that seemed to thicken, densify, like black ink spilled on absorbent paper. The shadows enveloped both the entity and Martin in an intimate and definitive embrace. For a fleeting instant, I perceived movement in the darkness that enveloped them, something similar to a portal opening to a place beyond human comprehension. Not exactly another world or dimension, but a state of existence fundamentally different from everything our senses were designed to process. And then, with the same naturalness with which night eventually yields to dawn, both disappeared. No physical trace remained besides the ancient guitar, carefully deposited in the center of the kitchen, its strings still softly vibrating with impossible harmonies. The Panajacal police investigated the disappearance, of course, based on the confession Martin had made to me before disappearing. They dragged the part of the lake I indicated. The process was slow, hindered by the extreme depth of the volcanic waters and the treacherous currents. 3 weeks later, they found Carmen Ixtabalan's remains, exactly as Martin had described, tied to heavy stones that should have kept her hidden forever in the shadowy depths. Dental identification and DNA analysis confirmed what we already knew. Her family could finally perform the proper funeral rituals, putting her soul to rest according to our ancestral traditions. As for Martin, he was never found. Not a hair, not a footprint, not a single clue to his whereabouts. To the official authorities, he fled, consumed by guilt after confessing his crime, fearing imprisonment, seeking to start over somewhere, distant with a new identity. It's a perfectly logical explanation, rational, comforting in its simplicity, but it's not the truth. 5 years have passed since that night. Alicia and I now live in my mother's house, close to the village center, surrounded by the family and community that supported us through difficult times. My daughter grew up without memories of her father. She was only 2 when he disappeared. When she asks about him, I tell her carefully edited versions of the truth appropriate for her age. Someday when she's older, I might tell her everything, or perhaps not. Some stories are too heavy to share. Sometimes on particularly quiet nights, when the lake is calm as a mirror and the stars seem close enough to touch, I think I hear distant chords from an ancient guitar. It's not a frightening sensation, more like a solemn reminder that there are forces beyond our understanding, cosmic scales that eventually reach balance. Something curious began to happen in the months following Martin's disappearance. Women from the village, and eventually from neighboring villages, began to seek me out. They arrived discreetly, often at twilight, nervously looking over their shoulders. They shared in whispers stories of abuse and injustice. They showed recent bruises and old scars. "Is it true?" they would ask, fragile hope shining in eyes tired of crying. "Does he really come when a woman suffers?" I have no definitive answers to give them. I cannot promise supernatural interventions or metaphysical justice. What I can offer, however, is something that was given to me by Elder Doña Esperanza, months after the events of that night. The old woman called me to her house and, with hands trembling from age, handed me a small, worn leather book, its pages, yellowed by time, filled with delicate ancient handwriting. It has been passed down through generations, she explained. From healer to healer, it contains the song you heard that night, the melody that El Justiciero plays when he comes to collect his debts. I learned the melody, its strange patterns and dissonant intervals that seem to vibrate with a frequency not entirely belonging to this world. I don't play it. I don't dare. But I teach it to the women who come to me, so they can hum it softly, like a prayer or an incantation. Sing it to your aggressor while he sleeps, I instruct, repeating the words that Doña Esperanza shared with me. It's not a guarantee of intervention, but a reminder, a warning. It's difficult to explain to skeptics what happened in our small house in the mountains of Guatemala. The rational mind desperately seeks explanations within the parameters of the known: collective hallucinations, psychological suggestion, elaborate coincidences. And perhaps they're right. Perhaps everything has a perfectly mundane explanation. Perhaps Martín, consumed by guilt and tormented by his conscience, simply fled into the night and met his own end, accidental or intentional, in some remote corner of the forest where he will never be found. But in the last 5 years, I've received whispers from distant villages, from isolated indigenous communities in the mountains, stories of violent men who began to hear strange music during the early morning hours, of aggressors who, looking out the window into the darkness, saw a tall and skeletal figure silently watching them, playing an ancient guitar under a wide-brimmed hat. Some of these men changed their ways, abandoning destructive behaviors, seeking redemption. Others ignored the warnings, and then simply were no longer there. Like Martín, they disappeared without a trace, as if they had been erased from reality itself. In the mountains of Guatemala, where the ancient and the modern coexist in delicate balance, where millennial traditions breathe alongside smartphones and internet, some truths remain immutable. Justice finds its ways, even when human systems fail. If you ever come to visit our beautiful lake, surrounded by dormant volcanoes and colorful villages, you might hear women humming a strange melody as they weave or wash clothes on the water's edge. It's not exactly a cheerful song, nor properly sad. It's something other, something that echoes with a different kind of truth. It's a reminder, whispered through generations. In the deepest shadows of this world, there exists a silent man with a wide-brimmed hat and an ancient guitar, and he is always listening, waiting to be summoned by those who have nowhere else to run. If this story impacted you, share in the comments which aspect of the supernatural avenger you found most disturbing. The music that initially only the target could hear, the void where his face should be, or perhaps the idea that there are forces beyond our comprehension that balance the scales when human systems fail. Subscribe for more Latin American legends that hold deeper truths than we might care to admit. And don't forget to leave your like if this account brought you any reflection on justice, guilt, and redemption. Until the next story. And remember, some melodies were not made for ordinary ears. There are legends that are born of lies, but there are those that are born of truth. The difference is that when they are real, you never sleep easy again.